Hello and welcome to Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben DiMono here for another foray into Dante and the Divine Comedy. This week we are looking at Cantos. Oh, what was it? I'm blanking on it. 15? No. Yes. 14, excuse me. Cantos 14, 15 through 20. So a little bit shorter take for this week. Not quite as much to read, but anyway, we made it through Mars and Jupiter. Mars being the sphere where the warriors for Christ, the defenders of the faith, are, and Jupiter being the sphere of the just. We kind of saw the beginning of Mars last time at the end of Canto 14, where Dante and Beatrice ascend to that sphere, and they see all of the warriors for God coming down arrayed as a cross. One just brief programming note before we get into all the content for this week. I'll be, and this only matters of course if you're following along these videos as I am posting them. If you're watching this in the future, you don't care. But I'll be traveling next week, so I am actually adjusting the Dante schedule a little bit. We are still going to finish on May 24th, because that is Pentecost, and the idea was for this series to be Lent and then Easter. However, what I had before was the last 2 weeks we were only reading like 3 cantos each of those weeks, and I had done that in order to stretch it out to Pentecost. So what we'll do is next time we will read Cantos 21, let me make sure I have that right, 21 to 27, and then the time after that we will read 28 through 33, which is the end. So no video next week on the 10th, and then we'll be back with through Canto 27 on the 17th, and through Canto 33 by the 24th to finish it off. Alright, so this week, I find as we get into some of these later cantos, whereas we've talked about a bit, and I won't beat the dead horse too much more, at least not today, as far as the differences between Paradiso and the other 2 canticles. But as we've talked before, and talked some last week, the poem is such in Paradiso where the narrative itself recedes into the background and forces us to focus on God. All of the details and everything that are so vivid in Inferno, and even, we start to make that transition in Purgatorio, but it's still quite vivid there, really become, it becomes much harder to visualize what's going on in Paradiso, and that's intentional because our focus is less on the things around us, less on the narrative, and more on God and preparation for the beatific vision that will come at the end of this canticle. And so because of that, it becomes, our division that we've used in these videos becomes a little bit tough as far as summary, symbols, and then kind of reflection or devotional section of this that I've tried to work in. So I'll still kind of try and keep that, but I think we'll find that those sections become more and more intertwined as we go on. So of the 6 cantos we read this time, the first 4, well, 3.5 really, are focused on Mars. And on Mars, Dante spends most of his time talking to Cacciaguida, who turns out, is his great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather, one of those 2. Anyway, he's a long way off in the family chain. Somebody who fought in the Crusades, you could certainly have an interesting discussion about how does Dante evaluate the Crusades versus how we do that today. Was there, does his different perspective maybe illuminate some things for us about an event that most people today would say was wrong and was unfortunate, to somebody who has a more positive view of the Crusades, as Dante probably does than those of us. is he able to illuminate something that maybe we miss about that? I mean, I think there'd be a lot of interesting perspectives you could take with that. I'm not really going to go in that direction today. So, like so much of the Divine Comedy, there's so many themes to explore, and I think that would be a very interesting one. But what struck me more in terms of the time on Mars isn't so much the fact that here are the warriors of God, and Dante means that both in a apologetic sense, but also in a very literal sense of those who took up the sword in defense of the church, but is more the kind of conversation that Cacciaguida and Dante have in Canto 17, where they discuss, Dante kind of asks him, okay, I've been hearing all of these prophecies about what's going to happen to me and happen to the city of Florence. Can you give me some insight into what that's all about? And this to me is absolutely fascinating because Cacciaguida, on the one hand, says, yes, everything that you've been hearing from Inferno, where the first prophecy we heard about Dante's fate from Chiacho the Hog down with the gluttons in Canto 6, I want to say, of Inferno. We hear all these doomsday prophecies. You're going to be kicked out of Florence. You're going to suffer. You're going to lose. The political party you're a part of is going to be split in two. And it's going to turn on you, and you are going to be rejected and live your life in failure. Which, of course, is where Dante, the writer, was at as he was writing the Divine Comedy. But Dante, the character, is at a point in his life where that hasn't happened yet. And so we get all these ominous prophecies, as you've noticed, I'm sure, as we've been going through the Divine Comedy. And Cacciaguida doesn't contradict them, but what he does, and what I think is one of the very powerful themes running through both Mars and the cantos involving there, but also, kind of comes into play with the two cantos we have in Jupiter as well, is this idea of perspective and of having this heavenly perspective of life. Because Cacciaguida then comes back and says, but yet you're going to find salvation. You're going to be remembered. This is going to be horrible for you, but it's not the end of the story. It's a very powerful moment, and you could kind of read it where Cacciaguida is basically telling Dante, yeah, you're going to write your comedy, and its fame is going to outlive you and your troubles and your enemies and all this stuff, and he's basically predicting Dante's success of the poem, and on one hand it kind of feels like Dante's patting his back and be like, look at this great thing I'm going to write, and it's going to be awesome, and I'm going to achieve fame. But on the other hand, I don't really think that's what he's doing. I think what he's doing more is trying to show himself, first and foremost, by extension us, the wider perspective that is needed to evaluate the horrible things that he went through. This exile and this failure and everything. And it's like, yeah, all those things are going to be true. Everything the people in hell were telling you and purgatory are telling you is true. But it's not until you get that perspective from paradise that you're able to see the whole story. And so we get this powerful sense of how Dante has come to see himself. Dante, the writer in this case, because as I said a moment ago, Dante the character is pre-Dante's exile. Dante the writer is post his exile. And I think we get insight into a man who is very much, throughout the comedy, is very much in the process of working through the psychological damage that caused him. And no doubt the crisis of self and the crisis of faith and the crisis of politics and, that came with that exile and that failure that he experienced. And here in Canto 17 of Paradiso, where he talks to Cacciaguida, and Cacciaguida basically gives him that larger perspective, we get a sense of a man who has come to peace with his failures and has a resounding trust in God to bring good out of this evil. That, to me, what is so powerful here. And it's really how Dante sees has come. That's a perspective that's rampant throughout the comedy, isn't it? How does Dante see the church? He hates Pope Boniface VIII. He just hates that guy. and he hates the corruptions in the church, and he hates the corruption in the holy orders. I mean, we just saw that in the section we read last time, where we have the St. Thomas denouncing the Dominicans, and St. Bonaventure denouncing the Franciscans. And, Dante is not shy about the corruption of the church. But yet he has this wider perspective that the church was something ordained by God, and something that will be reformed, and will be redeemed and cleansed of the wickedness that it's suffering now. And so that's it. And he has the same sense of politics as well. This glory of the Roman Empire, and that the horror that is modern Florence. Is it going to be the end of that story? And so Dante, I think we're getting a glimpse into, in the comedy, his own psychological journey as somebody post-exile, and then coming out the other side and being able to get a sense of peace and a absolute trust in God to turn things around and to make that bigger picture come about. It's interesting because Dante, I wonder what his perspective of all this is in heaven now, because in 2008, just a few years ago, is when his exile from Florence was officially rescinded by the city. So how is that? He has to wait 700 years after he's been exiled to officially have the city embrace him again. That's a long-term perspective that you have to have. But yet here we see him believing it in, roughly 1315, 1320, almost 700 years before Florence acknowledges their fault and welcomes him back into the city. And he's able to say, it's okay because I have that larger picture. Very powerful moment. And we get a sense of that too, as I said, when we ascend to the next sphere in Jupiter, where the just are. And this is interesting to me too, because we revisit the sense of, is it unjust for, at least in Dante's world, for the virtuous pagans to be condemned to the Inferno? Now granted, they're in limbo, which compared to the rest of the Inferno is a pretty sweet vacation spot. But they are barred from paradise. So is that just? And we get two answers here that I think are very powerful. The first one we get is when Dante kind of asks this question, or he doesn't ask it, but the eagle answers it anyway, is, who are you to question what is God's justice? And that's very true, but that's not a satisfying answer to us as humans when we think about those questions. We think about today, well, what about people who've never heard of the gospel, even today? And so we get that first question, but then we also get the Emperor Trajan, and I'm blanking on the second name, but there's somebody from Troy who are in this circle with the just. And we see that, whoa, actually, by divine providence, God was able to help them find salvation. In the case of the Emperor Trajan, we're told that he, and I don't think this myth is original to Dante, but he's returned to his body long enough to be converted and to become a Christian. And the guy from Troy, he's given a vision from God. And so there's this dual sense of, on the one hand, you don't get to question God just because you don't understand it and don't like it, and it's troubling, the fact that the virtuous pagans are in the Inferno. On the other hand, you don't know the limits of God's mercy. It reminds me of the quote from Augustine that has now been made famous by the movie Calvary. Not Calvary. Calvary. Not cavalry like horses. Calvary. Those words are always quite confusing to me. I don't know, something in my brain doesn't like those two words. But Calvary, as in the hill where Jesus died, starring Brendan Gleeson. A remarkable movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But the movie begins with a quote from Augustine, and it says, "Do not presume or do not despair, one of the thieves was saved, referring to the thieves who were crucified on either side of Jesus. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Do not presume, one of the thieves was damned. That's a really powerful sentiment if you think about it. And I think that it sums up what ought to be the Christian attitude on questions like the one Dante has. Which is, we can make two dueling mistakes there, I think, in our theology. We can make a mistake that says, well, of course God's going to let, that man. Why wouldn't he? That'd be stupid. That'd be absurd. That wouldn't be just if God didn't let the virtuous pagans into heaven. And I think we have to stop ourselves and say, whoa, wait a second. Because the second we say, if God doesn't do that, he's not just, we have put ourselves in the judgment seat, and we are on a very dangerous road where we have now placed ourselves above God in judgment. On the other hand, we can go in this other direction where it's like, anybody who isn't saved by saying a prayer or receiving the sacraments, or however we want to think about it, the ultra-fundamentalist approach, is you're done. You're going to hell. It doesn't matter how much good you did in your life. You have game over, man. It's done. And I think that true Christian theology, both historically, biblically, logically, rebukes both those sides. And the way Augustine puts it is absolutely perfect. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Do not presume, one of the thieves was damned. And that quote just comes through so well in this section. So to me, that is, like I said, this is where the different sections in terms of the videos of summary, symbols, reflection get a bit jumbled, because I think what we've been talking about is really what I wanted to leave us with as far as a devotional reflection from this part of Paradiso. That what Dante is doing for us is calling us into a greater understanding, a deeper understanding of what it means to live out our faith, what it means to live out our lives. And that deeper understanding is that we must have a broader perspective, or at the very least realize our perspective is narrow. The way we live our lives is like how Dante talks about the people down in the Inferno, where they see a little bit into the future, but there's a lot of stuff that's really clouded and everything, and so they get stuff wrong, and they have imperfect vision and all that. And that's kind of how we live our lives, right? I mean, we can see things coming down the road a little bit, but it's so imperfect, it's so flawed. And we see our own failures right now. We see our own weaknesses and the way that life is just sometimes not going well. And I think we need to have trust and peace, as Dante does in this larger perspective. But at the same time, it can't be, peace and trust can't just be this kind of resignation of throwing up our hands and saying, well, God's going to handle it. It'll all be okay. Everything will be okay. I might screw up. I'm imperfect and everything, but that's okay. God still loves me. And that's true. God still loves us even when we screw up. But we can fall into that mistake of presuming, presumption. Do not presume one of the thieves was damned. On the other hand, we can just be overwhelmed by despair in this life too, and despair as a result of seeing our own failings and our own weaknesses and the hardships of life. And that's where we have to say, well, don't fall into the other trap either. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Right, and so I think Dante is calling us into a larger perspective that's not naive, one where we don't presume. We take our failings seriously. We work on them. We submit them to God. We don't just say, oh, I'm just okay being me as I am right now. No, you shouldn't be. You're flawed. You're sinful. you should not just be okay being in that state. On the other hand, neither should you despair about being in that state. Because there's a larger perspective going on in both those cases that you don't see. And so we ought to work towards overcoming the hardships of life, overcoming our own sins, our own failures, all that, while simultaneously having that incredible trust in God. And so this is not, when we talk, a lot of times I think when we talk about in the church about having a larger perspective or trusting God, it becomes just this call to naivety. And I think it's very clear Dante is not calling us to that. He's calling us to live out in our lives that Augustine quote, "Do not presume. One of the thieves was damned, do not despair. One of the thieves was saved." So to live out that perspective, I think would be the encouragement we ought to take away from this section of the Divine Comedy. All right, so like I said at the beginning, 2 weeks from now, on the 17th, I will put up the next video, and that will be reading Cantos 21 through 27. And then the week after that, it's our final, well, I won't say it's the final Dante video because I'm a bit obsessed, and no doubt I will be back with more things to say about Dante at a future point. But as far as our reading plan goes, we will finish the Divine Comedy 2 weeks from now on the 24th. So that's all for now. I'm Dante Bono, this is Sci-Fi Christian. Goodbye, everyone.